Dr. Lise van Susteren is a general and forensic psychologist and a psychiatrist, apologize about that, psychiatrist in Washington, D.C., and an expert on the physical and psychological impacts of climate change. She also hates having her biography read. So I'm going to flip through this a little bit quickly. She just said, tell them that I'm a 20-year climate activist. But I have to just mention, I mean, she just has an incredible activities that she's been involved in for people in around the world, including this group of young climate activists in Montana who recently won their lawsuit against the state of Montana for its climate policies. So without more, I think I will stop sharing, if that's okay, and let Lisa take over here.
Great. Well, thank you for the introduction. And also, I would like to say that I'm pretty impressed with all the work that you all are doing. It just is so inspiring to hear what people around the country are doing. I have a rather narrow view, but these activities springing up all over that have been persisting now, but planting trees, the warblers, of course, I don't know why there was this death, massive 350 bird death, but maybe another time we can talk about it. I'm going to head right into the talk. I usually do a little bit of a chat, but I know we've got big fish frying tonight, and so I will just get on with it. So I don't know that we'll have time for questions. It doesn't seem that we will, but you certainly can get back to me, and this is being recorded, so that might be helpful as well. Okay, so there are three parts here. The first part is the overview, identifying what climate impacts carry the biggest psychological burdens. Part two will be messaging, deepening our understanding of resistance and good communication. Part three, action, carrying the flag. So what you'll be hearing today is a lot. It's heavy. But I'm going to surprise you at some point with some fun stuff that I'm going to throw in. So stay tuned. Likely when you're feeling at your worst and wondering if I'm ever going to get off the rag, that might be the very moment when I bring up the fun stuff, which a lot of which you guys are already doing. So well done. Okay. So I would like to say that well-off people with power, money, and may minimize or deny the severity of the climate crisis, perhaps as a cover for their outsized role in it. And some of these same people accuse our warnings about what's happening as espousing doom and gloom. I recently, in the Wall Street Journal, I read an article that referred to kids with climate distress as having climate hypochondriasis. And I'll get to that in a bit because we have a survey coming out of 16,000 kids, and that may address some of their denial about the severity of the issue. So let's just say that if you aren't worried about climate or you aren't admitting it, then you likely have climate denial disorder. And I see that I don't have that slide up, but that's okay. You don't need to see it in black and white. It is climate denial disorder. You heard it first from me, and I would be happy to have you bandy it around when people confront you about your climate activities or beliefs. So, all right, everything related to climate instability, all the losses, injuries, illnesses, and displacement from extreme weather events, storms, floods, fires, heat waves, and the slower moving chronic and indirect impacts from sea level rise, droughts, ocean acidification, I don't know what's going on here with my computer, or maybe it's just me, poor air quality, the spread of disease and problems with food and water, mass migrations, and all the geopolitical ramifications carry with them an attendant emotional toll. And I have so often given talks to people who you would otherwise expect to be very conversant in this. You talk to them about the emotional toll, and they'll say, geez, we hadn't thought of that. Well, remember that they all carry with them an emotional toll. So the issue to underscore is there is no such thing as physical harm alone. As the ancient Romans said, mens sana in corpore sano. I had to take 4 years of Latin, so I trot this out. A healthy mind in a healthy body. Physical and psychological states are a two-way street. What affects us physically affects us mentally, and what affects us mentally affects our physical health. And we all know that. As the grip of social and intergenerational injustice from inaction on climate tightens, our success in driving change turns on a defining human capacity, our ability to stir empathy. Because emotional connection is at the heart of what gets people to change. So consider how you would feel if the place you call home would be burned down, blown away, dried up, flooded. When you lose your possessions, maybe your pets, your livelihood, your community, and see injuries, illness, and death, the mix of fear, anger, sorrow, and trauma could easily drive a person to the breaking point. After extreme weather events, mental health professionals, oh, there's the flooding, here we are. After extreme weather events, mental health professionals are seeing surging numbers of people struggling with PTSD, major depression, generalized anxiety disorder. We are seeing a rise in drug and alcohol abuse, domestic violence, and a rise in child abuse. We have a responsibility to be straightforward about the impacts of climate change on the public. Don't back down. I'm going to tell you a personal story. It would be malpractice now, but in the past, doctors would sometimes downplay or hide life-threatening diagnoses from their patients, saying they didn't want to upset them. Or maybe the doctors were being avoidant, but we can talk about that another time. I was a medical student in France. A middle-aged woman with a history of breast cancer was hospitalized for back pain, which turned out to be metastases from her breast cancer that had gone to her spine. In the hallway outside her room on rounds, the attending physician, in a hushed tone, told us that he was going to tell her it was sciatica, so she wouldn't be upset. As we swept into her room from the hallway, she sat upright in her bed, and the attending, peering into her chart, I never liked this guy, commented about her sciatica. Exhaling deeply, she slumped back onto her pillow, murmuring how relieved she was, à cause de mon histoire, because of my history. How much more had she suffered, I have wondered, when she realized that she had not been told the truth. What actions might she have taken? What different choices might she have made had she known the reality? I am making this point. The public needs to know the reality of the dangers we face from climate. And what we not fully register is the urgency with which we need to act. And nobody wants to be a doom and gloomer or be called that, but there's a special way of presenting information that is so troubling as it is. And the primary goal is not to cover it up. We can't act upon something that we don't know about. So we are not just embroiled in climate change, we're in a climate emergency defined by Earth's climate systems. This is important: air, water, ice, our rocky surface, and the biosphere. Like a teeter-totter, these systems are constantly in a balancing state. Their interdependence assuring there are no violent ups and downs. But rapidly deteriorating conditions of these systems are causing them to destabilize with catastrophic consequences. So I'm going to go through a couple of slides. This one is blank, but I want to say that moreover, climate change can be abrupt, not just slow and incremental, unleashing forces that cause breakaway impacts in a matter of decades or just years. Climate scientists the world over warn the window on our ability to act in time is closing. We are reaching, and in some cases may already have crossed, tipping points, the time after which planetary upheaval becomes unstoppable. Apocalyptic alterations in the conditions of our planet are possible, inconsistent with our survival. I recommend you learn more about climate tipping points and not that I'm hawking it, but I wrote about them, and my work was vetted by Michael Mann for an online book to be published in the next few days, Climate and Your Mind. You can also email me. All right, so let's look at a couple of these tipping points. I'm thanking Al Gore for this. This is bright white ice, highly reflects the sun's energy and heat waves, that albedo effect, bouncing it back to outer space where the heat is lost. However, what happens when the ice is gone? Dark ocean water or other dark surfaces absorb the heat. When the ice has been on land, the melt results in sea level rise. The West Antarctic ice sheet, abbreviated WAIS, many scientists believe has begun an irreversible melt. Sea level rise of 10 to 15 feet, you heard me right, as early as 2060 is possible. That's directly from Jim Hansen, by the way. Now, the Atlantic Meridional Overturning Current, otherwise known as the thermohaline conveyor belt, also taken from Al Gore's presentations. What you can see, and it's a conveyor belt, you can see that. And here's the physics. Cold, salty water is heavy and falls to the bottom depths of the ocean. This turns the conveyor belt, driving the current that encircles the globe. It determines much of our weather and climate. If all goes well as it moves across the equator, hot temperatures cause evaporation, increasing the salinity, and as it moves northward, it continues to cool. Naturally, so it's colder and saltier and heavier. But the rapid melting of fresh water from Greenland's glaciers is reducing the salinity in addition to raising sea level, and the water is warmer due to the higher temperatures in the ocean. These two forces causing the conveyor belt current to slow. Scientists are deeply anxious because the current has already become destabilized and slowed perhaps as much as 20% or more. A shutdown would trigger disastrous upheavals in weather and climate all across the globe. The thermohaline conveyor belt also delivers nutrients all along its pathway, and an alteration in the delivery of the supply chain dramatically affects marine life with all of the cascading repercussions. So collapse of the oceans acidification. As excessive atmospheric CO2, and this is a little sciencey, disregard it if it's not your thing, dissolves in the ocean is becoming increasingly acidic. Overfishing and warming play a role, but the continuous breakdown of coral reefs and shell-bearing marine life in these acidic conditions cause ocean acidification. Here it is in detail. For those who like science, it's an easy graphic, one of the best that I've seen. Disregard it if it's not your thing. But do know that for 2 billion people, marine life is the primary source of protein. Others depend on it for financial survival. And when you break down all of the shells and the coral reefs, 3 out of 5 animals marine depend on the coral reefs for their survival. So moving on now to extinction rates. Everybody has heard this a million times, but I couldn't disregard it. They're 1,000 times higher than base rate. And note, this is a nuance that isn't often addressed. So it's important to remember that extinction is complete loss of a species. There's also such a thing as functional extinction. Functional extinction means that though some species may still exist, the overall numbers of critical species are too low to maintain the collaborative relationship essential to sustain it. So it may not only not thrive, the ecosystem may not survive. Here's something that has a great cause, frankly, for alarm, and that's the carbon bomb. As the tundra melts, previously frozen organic matter is decomposing. Think rotting meat in a broken freezer, giving off CO2 and the even more initially potent greenhouse gas, methane. Okay, So clathrate is Latin for the word cage. Again, my Latin background is gas that are frozen in ice. These are greenhouse gases frozen in ice, buried beneath the surface of the permafrost or under the seabed, especially of the Siberian ice shelf. Go to your map or Google and look at the Siberian ice shelf. These areas are melting, causing methane from decomposing organic matter to bubble up and be released into the atmosphere. Some scientists warn of a clathrate carbon bomb that could be the end of the trail. I'm going to play the video for you so you can see.
We're out standing on a frozen lake in interior Alaska, outside of the University of Alaska Fairbanks campus. And this ice is already about 20 centimeters thick. So as it's been freezing up, methane gas has been coming out of the bottom of the lake and getting trapped in the lake ice. If you look at the shore, you can see that there are lots of trees that are falling in the lake and they're dying. What's happening is the permafrost is thawing. The ice that was in the ground, when it melts, causes the ground surface to collapse. Then the forest falls in, and any organic matter, dead plant and animal remains that were in the permafrost, thaw out in the bottom of the lake. Microbes decompose it, and it generates methane. And methane doesn't like to stay in water in solution. It forms bubbles, and those bubbles make their way to the surface.
A little bit.
In the summertime, the bubbles pop and they enter the atmosphere. In the winter, however, this ice forms a cover on the surface of the lake, and the bubbles get trapped right under the ice. And then the ice thickens and freezes around them. And so what we have out here is like a time-lapse.
Oops. Oh, geez. Sorry about that. I'm going to play it and well,
we're out standing on a frozen lake
and here.
The bubbles get trapped. Yes, a molecule of methane is 25 times stronger than carbon dioxide.
That's it.
Methane is formed in millions of lakes around.
All right, so you get the picture. This is serious. People are not talking about it because the Siberian ice shelf is not a place that has been well explored, but go and look. It underscores our urgency. Other tipping points, some of you may know the Amazon is already flipping in some areas from a rainforest to a savanna. Savanna being a flat area covered with grasses and few trees, very different from a rainforest, usually found in hot, dry spots in Africa. Longer, wetter monsoon seasons. That's why you're getting terrible flooding events. Over 1/3 of Pakistan was flooded a few years back. It's flooding again. There are mudslides, etc. So obviously, these tipping points are extremely concerning. Global warming in general is driving the increasing frequency and intensity of extreme weather events that have doubled since the early 1990s. And some of us are lucky enough to be at a distance from the world's climate disasters, but you know, we're not potted plants sitting here in empathic identification with victims. It's painful seeing other people drowned, burned, flooded, and starved, right? And when disasters are no longer experienced solely as acts of God or nature, but derived from the behavior of humans, they're even more harmful because what happens from intentional negligence is much harder to put behind us than what happens accidentally. So let's go to heat waves. They are the leading weather-related killer in the U.S. There's 7 times the losses from floods. 500,000 people, it is estimated, died from heat in 2023, and that is a conservative number. The top 10 hottest years on record, you've heard this, occurred within the last decade. 2023 believed to be the hottest in more than 100,000 years. It is expected 2024 will be hotter. Experts say that without significant action, some cities in the Middle East, for example, will become uninhabitable before the end of the century. All over the U.S., we know records have been broken in the summer of 2024. I would like now to segue to some of the psychological impacts that aren't just associated with what we know from common sense, but for which we have some statistics. So for each standard deviation of increased temperature and change in rainfall, we can expect a 4% increase in conflict between individuals and a 14% increase in conflict between groups. These findings are valid for all ethnicities and across every region of the world. An increase in assaults, murders, and suicides as temperatures go up and rainfall changes must come as no surprise. And while any suicide is the result of complex forces, drought from persistent high temperatures is a major contributing factor to the explosive rise in suicides among farmers in India, rural Australia, South Africa. And in the US and Mexico, there have been studies that quantify these numbers. And now for some bombshell news. This is just really shakes me to my core. If you know someone struggling with infertility, or you yourself know how painful that is, sperm counts in American, Australian, and European men have fallen by more than 50%. Infertility is complex, but exposure to an unhealthy environment is one cause and has been dubbed environmental castration. A new factor in the mix: infertility is linked to rising temperatures. The decline appears to be transgenerational. That is, it is transferred to the next generation. So very sobering reality, obviously. So I'd like to now address some chronic climate conditions, drought. And let's think for a second what despair comes from watching and waiting for rains that don't come. Drought forces migration, and when water is scarce, conflict is right on its heels. The UN says, and this is the global picture, we're not talking about farmers that we know here in the US, but by 2030, nearly half of everyone in the world will be living in countries highly stressed for water. And then there's sea level rise. As I mentioned earlier, tens of millions of Americans live on coastlines, tens of millions. Worldwide, hundreds of millions live within 30 feet of sea level. Without a sharp reduction in greenhouse gas emissions, former NASA climate scientist Dr. James Hansen warns, global sea level is likely to increase, and I said this earlier, 10 to 13 feet in as few as 50 years. If you doubt Jim, that's fine, go ahead. But people have said he's had a very disturbing pattern of being right. Parts of our coastlines, coastal cities would still be sticking above the water, he says, but you couldn't live there. All right, moving on. Air pollution. The World Health reports that 9 out of 10 people breathe unhealthy air. Air pollution is largely the result of burning fossil fuels. When coal, oil, and gas are burned, they create pollutants that undergo a chemical reaction and form particulate matter, just a fancy name for clumps of toxic stuff in the air that we can inhale. Warmer temperatures speed up these chemical reactions, increasing the concentration of pollutants in the air. And while the focus is on, you've heard it a million times, 2.5 micron particulate matter, check out the real culprit way over on the right side of this slide, ultrafine particulate matter measuring less than a micron. When we inhale, the tiny particles evade natural barriers and can cross the alveoli in our lungs. They enter the bloodstream and then can be strewn throughout the body. The presence of this foreign material triggers inflammation, setting us up for a multitude of illnesses and conditions, including, we don't actually need to include this, but I will. It shows that it's not only what we inhale going across our lungs, but what we breathe in through our nose. That particulate matter, those little black dots, cross the nasal mucosa and they can go directly into the brain. Park that thought, because brain inflammation can lead to a whole multitude of illnesses. We'll get to those in a second. So here's what we got. Air pollution is linked to cancers, respiratory illnesses, cardiovascular disease, permanent decreased lung volume in children. It's one reason many well-to-do families are moving out of Beijing. And other conditions. It is linked to dementia And this is the likely source or impact of the brain inflammation causing the dementias, including Alzheimer's types, because there are many different kinds, as well as other neurodegenerative disorders such as Parkinson's and amyotrophic lateral sclerosis. Not pretty, and the linkage to brain inflammation is clear. Multiple lines of evidence support a link between neuroinflammation, brain inflammation, and classic psychiatric illnesses, major depressive disorders, bipolar disorder, schizophrenia, obsessive compulsive disorders. Increased rates of psychosis in young people have also been linked to pollution. On days of poor air quality, visits to the ER for panic attacks and threats to commit suicide increase. Polluted air in general reduces cognitive performance. Much more to say about that, but I won't. I'll move on to other ecosystems that are implicated in higher temperatures. Our food supply at risk. You know, we're obviously in better shape than many people, but hunger is a problem for most people in the world. And climate change leads to food insecurity by reducing the amount and quality of the food we can produce. And I'll let you just read this. For each 1 degree rise in temperature centigrade, a 10% reduction in the output, the agricultural harvest. And also the crops that are grown under elevated atmospheric CO2 contain less protein. Of course, protein is a critical nutrient for us to be healthy, particularly in children. These micronutrient deficiencies are linked to cognitive disorders, to depression, behavioral disorders, and mental illness, and a host of other physical illnesses and conditions, and death. Now, many of you, I said, yes, increased levels of CO. Okay. One thing that probably a lot of people haven't seen, but I often talk to doctors, and I worked in Africa as a doctor for a year, and I saw children with protein deficiency illnesses. It's called the kwashiorkor syndrome. They have a distended belly. It's due to ascites, and it's not something that you easily forget. The UN Environmental Program has declared that transitioning to a low-carbon, plant-based diet is the only way to save the world from hunger, fuel shortages, and climate change. A global shift towards a vegan diet is becoming essential. I had some slides about that, but I decided we would push on. I'm sure you've heard before about what diet, how much our diet is important to carbon emissions. Coral reefs, I'm not going to bother. You've already heard about it a million times. You know about it. One thing you may not have heard about that I think is really sobering also are toxins. There are certain algae formations, blue-green algae, that are filled with a certain kind of bacteria called cyanobacteria. And they produce a toxin. I'll say what it is, BMAA. It's called beta-methylaminoalanine for the chemistry specialists here. And it too has been linked to Alzheimer's, ALS, and Parkinson's. I'm not going to get into the details of how we know that or where some of those toxins have been found in commercial fish markets. I'm not going to go into the details, but they have been, so we're exposed to it. Move on now to zoonotic illnesses. That is illnesses that pass from animals to people. Some 70% of emerging diseases in humans are zoonotic, with an estimated, listen to this, 1.7 million more we don't know about. So, vector-borne and infectious diseases, Lord, we know about this. This was from May 2018. The CDC warned that we were in danger because we were not prepared to handle an upcoming surge of illnesses. No kidding. Lyme, malaria, dengue fever, West Nile, chikungunya, Zika, and these are from viruses, bacteria, and protozoa. that are passed on to us by vectors such as mosquitoes, ticks, fleas, rats, mice. And now, of course, we know that the scariest scenario was waiting in the wings. And I have a question mark because we still don't know if it was a zoonotic illness or it was fiddling in the lab there in Wuhan, the province. I've forgotten the name of the province, but I'm sure all of you are familiar. Increasing contact with vectors has long been known as a possible risk that could trip a pandemic. Population rise, expanding urbanization, industrial farming of animals, deforestation, and the illegal poaching and selling of wildlife or their parts, trafficking, and now at crisis levels are causes of zoonotic illnesses. But so is disrupted climate because it causes unnatural and unhealthy changes to ecosystems, forcing disease-carrying animals, including the vectors that we just talked about, to try to find new places to live, and some of those places bring them closer to humans. So a few selected other indirect impacts of ecosystems disrupted. Let's talk briefly about biodiversity loss. I know this is important to this group. I had to take my scalpel to some of the material, but we can always talk about it another time. In our fight for the climate, it has been said that we should think of people, not polar bears, a legitimate reminder that privileged groups overlook the environmental injustices affecting people in places where socioeconomic and challenges and systemic racism impede the ability to be heard. But animals are central to our existence for many reasons, including supporting the intricate relationships of natural life critical to our survival. In the last 50 years, I can't stand to say these numbers, wildlife numbers have plummeted by nearly half. As many as 50% of all species will be on a path to extinction by mid-century. And regarding our relationship with animals, was it an error in translation? Hebrew scholars tell us that it isn't dominion over animals that was written in ancient biblical text, but rather that we as humans have a grave responsibility to protect them. We risk profound personal and psychosocial damage as we stray from the ecosystems we were evolved to share with other species. So special populations at risk, I'd like you just to think for a minute here: the elderly, the sick, the disabled, the mentally ill, the poor, those living in the bullseye of disaster-prone areas along coastlines and rivers, tornado alleys, inner cities with the heat island effect, first responders. We have seen how quickly our systems can be overwhelmed and our faith in them shaken. Faith in a functional government is the sine qua non of stable society. Left out of the list of these especially vulnerable individuals are often the climate experts and activists. That's us, the climate Cassandras. Cassandra being the Greek mythological figure who was cursed by Apollo to see future harms, but never to have her warnings believed. In the grip of images of future disasters they can't get out of their minds, desperately issuing anguished warnings, these climate Cassandras, and this is us, can suffer with a version of the classic PTSD, which I have dubbed pre-traumatic stress. But most of all, of course, it is young people who are hurt. Our children are aware that the window of opportunity to stop the worst of the impacts of climate change is closing. In Australia, in the first published climate change delusion, a depressed 17-year-old boy was hospitalized for refusing to drink water. He believed it would bring death to millions in his drought-ridden country. I talked to the doctor at Melbourne Children's Hospital, treated him. This was many years ago. It might be different now, but he didn't want me to use his name. But he said to me, I have a whole clinic full of kids with climate anxiety. I am the co-author, by the way, of a survey on climate distress in 10,000 youth from 10 countries that was published in The Lancet in December of 2021. It shows 3/4 of young people are afraid of the future because of climate disruption. Half say it affects their daily lives. More than half say they feel doomed, and 2/3 lay the blame squarely at the feet of policymakers. I am the co-author also of a soon-to-be-released state-by-state survey of climate distress in 16,000 U.S. youth, coming out likely mid-October. I am the expert witness. Everyone always asks me this stuff, so I bring it up. It's kind of old hat to me now, so I feel repetitious, but people like to hear about it. In several legal cases in which youth plaintiffs have resorted to going to court, for crying out loud, to get policies to help protect them from worsening conditions that assure accelerating climate consequences. In my expert reports, I describe the psychological damages. And I will say that just briefly, I'll bring those cases up. You've probably heard of them. Juliana, the Held versus the state of Montana, which Leslie mentioned, Navihini versus the Hawaii Department of Transportation. Juliana's pending. Held was settled last summer. We're awaiting a Supreme Court ruling from an appeal. And a few weeks ago, the Hawaii Department of Transportation said, waved the white flag. They said, we give up. We're not only going to work with you, we're going to put our ambitions even higher. So hooray for Governor Josh Green. He was a key person in all this. Youth in all these cases are suing government for violation of their constitutional rights, whether federal or state. I will say about the plaintiffs only that hearing their voices, and this becomes relevant when we talk about action, witnessing their tears, fears, and hopes changed me forever. If policymakers spent a few minutes with these kids, I believe that many of them would make it their life's work, or at least make it a priority to see that legislation was passed commensurate with the risks and with the abject feelings of anger, despair, and sense of betrayal and abandonment that young people in growing numbers are experiencing. Ask me about supporting the outreach and advocacy group that is seeking to see policymakers have them hear this directly from young people the way many of us have. And of course, the should I have a baby question that's coming up, increasingly being asked. Young people worry about climate chaos and the carbon costs of bringing another person into the world. Then there's something which you probably don't know a lot about, but it's well known within the medical psychiatric field, and that's what is called ACEs, Adverse Childhood Experiences. And the number of adverse childhood experiences that a child has increases their morbidity and mortality. So the repeated exposure to climate trauma opens up young people to the same impacts. So this is a very important graphic to remember. It shows that what we are doing to kids affects the quality of their life and the length of their life. Then there is something called transgenerational epigenetic inheritance. It's carried by an on-off gene in the DNA code that codes for stress. And what can happen is the previous generation experiencing anxiety can cause that same change in the next generation, awakening psychological trauma in succeeding generations. Not pretty. And not everything that counts can be counted. Downstream social dimensions of climate trauma are really important because it's the inchoate, insidious, complex, and unconscious psychological states driven by climate trauma, not lending themselves to studies and precise numbers that are the most profoundly damaging and drive systemic emotional conditions society will find difficult to treat and surmount. The emotional toll from climate trauma insinuates itself into every aspect of our lives, collectively affecting the national mood, shaping our culture in ways that drive our economy, our politics, the quality of life in our communities and families. It increasingly affects how we treat each other. Much of the violence in the world, and listen to this statement, it's mine, but it's true, can be explained, been in this business for a long time, can be explained by unaddressed anxiety emanating from fears of impotence and vulnerability. Climate change evokes a profound sense of both. So here's that time for a treat. All the bells should be going off. I'm having fun with this. Let's take a brief dip into a place to change our mood, because it's equally important that we push for knowing the joys of the natural world, impressing upon ourselves that there is so much to elevate with what I have called the charms, tricks, and secrets of nature and how they restore our mental health. Now, I was going to say, listen to this, but you can't because I couldn't get the audio for some reason to work. But do me a favor, go online, go to a YouTube, and listen to the sounds of the swamp at daybreak. And I promise you, the next time I give this presentation, I will have fixed it. It is so unbelievably enchanting, and it takes you into such a different world. And it's a field of psychoacoustics that I find fascinating. And wanted to share with you. But it's the soothing sound of a healthy ecosystem, in contrast to human-made sounds, which activate our amygdala and trigger stress. The amygdala, you recall, is the fight, flight, or freeze center, and it triggers stress. We have evolved to experience these sounds as calming, the sounds of nature. If I could play it, I think you would be similarly enchanted. Something else that's well, I'm told you can't hear that, so I'll pass. Ethiopian church forests, I bet you haven't heard of these. Diversity is thriving in the church forests of Ethiopia. In the early part of the 20th century, 45% of Ethiopia was covered with forest. Now it's down to just 5%. But that is changing because of the initial passion of a single person. As Martin Luther King said, you don't have to see the whole staircase, just take the first step. Isn't this cool? And connecting the church forest to each other is now their next step. Then there's the half Earth policy, which I'll just bring up very briefly, of E.O. Wilson. He says we don't have to restore the whole thing, just restore and preserve 50% of the critical areas of great biodiversity. So look at this before and after photo of a beach in Mumbai, where 500 tons of trash were cleared in just over 35 weeks, when again, a single person launched the project and everybody joined in. So now you guys are all, or at least I know Leslie is, the soil and planting and things like that are important to you. And do you know about mycorrhizal fungi network? Wrapped around and in plant roots, the mycorrhizae are a medusa-like confection of tunnels, little tiny tunnels like straw, that provide water and nutrients to plants, living symbiotically with them. And also, get this, they remove atmospheric CO2 in the process, 1 ton per acre per year. And just inches below ground level, it's why people, I never knew why people were screaming no-till. I'd scream along with them no-till, but I didn't know why. But it's because they rip up these mycorrhizae. Also, pesticides, herbicides, fertilizers on crops can harm and kill them as well. An astonishing fact, 3 to 4 tons of mycorrhizae are present in our soil for every person on Earth. All right, I'm going to have to step it up. Soil is food for our mood. I was talking with Leslie just before you were on, and that is that there are certain microorganisms in the soil that actually activate serotonin and neuroepinephrine, which are feel-good neurotransmitters in the brain. So dousing yourself or dosing yourself with a little bit of soil, especially that wonderful scent, the petrichor, when rain falls on dry earth. We've all smelled it and loved it. So dirt is destiny. Who knew? The role of exercise. Dirt as a microbiome may double as an antidepressant. You know how many people are always talking about gardening and what it does for them. There's a reason. So the role of exercise. I'm just going to very quickly go over this, but I think we all know the importance of exercise. Hundreds of academic studies now show, I remember how annoyed patients used to get when I would say to exercise, but our time in nature significantly reduces our blood pressure, lowers our heart rate, A1C, perception of pain. It even has immunologic advantages. Forest bathing, Shinrin-yoku, you've heard of it. The elements called phytoncides, which kill invading pests, have a positive effect on us. And they even have antiviral and anti-tumor properties. So there's just nothing that beats exercise. Phytoremediation is a fun one. Oh yeah, there's the proof. Phytoremediation, very quickly. Bet you didn't know that leaves are covered. Shinrin-yoku, I'm skipping some of this stuff because we have to hurry. Shinrin-yoku, yes, you know about it, but here's something really fun. Leaves are covered with microbes that break down pollution. So I was listening to Leslie talk about the 65 trees you're planting here and planting there. Boy, you're cleaning up the air with that stuff. So very, very important work. Want to get on to national security issues and explain how some of the geopolitical issues that we are facing are directly the result of climate. The worst drought in 900 years put hundreds of thousands of people in the road in search of safety. You've seen these photos, you know, violence and illness is all along the way. They go places where people don't want them and can't help them. We know about all of these terrible tragedies, people trying to cross to Europe and drowning, and all in search of escaping what has started off as a root cause was climate with drought conditions that put them on the road and then caused conflict. One of the things that has been a consequence is that it has driven up fears of the other and has been resulted in a resurgence of the divisive nationalism that has fractured the post-World War II coalitions, European Union, etc., and really threatens democratic leadership. And I'll say that in times of peril and scarcity, we see a rise in authoritarian government. It makes me very fearful about threats to democracy because people turn to what they perceive as strong leaders to protect them, and they may be willing to give up their freedoms in exchange for the promise of perceived security. But heaven help us from the tyrants and the bullies I used to say could be unleashed, but now I say have been unleashed. And I'll say this as a former psychological profile of world leaders at the CIA. I do fear for our democratic way of life. Section 2, you can exhale. I'll go quickly. Read this. My husband says I need to try to be funny. I don't see a lot of funny stuff about climate, but in any event, I'd like to go speeding into the reasons, the individual reasons why we deny, downplay, dishatch, disassociate, etc. And here are some of the reasons. For money, short-term profits are put ahead of our health. For power, politicians craving power come to mind in particular. To avoid losing face, if you said no before, the confirmation bias assures that it's much harder for us to change our minds. So we're not going to. We were wrong before, no way. Feeling emasculated, only girly men are afraid of Mother Nature, right? You may be ostracized. Membership in a group requires not challenging tightly held beliefs. Losing a feeling of security, fearing the center cannot hold, to quote Yeats, that God could let or the world would simply fall apart can make them feel they will fall apart. And they're deeper issues. Climate change is a veritable Pandora's box of dark thoughts. We are transient beings here, subject to the laws of physics. In the grand scheme of things, impermanent, vulnerable, not the masters of the universe we would like to imagine. As conditions worsen steadily, inexorably, evoking awful images of the future, including that civilization may not survive, the narrative of the climate crisis is a metaphor for our own insignificance, aging, and death. We strive to get those thoughts out of our minds, so we deny, disavow, and defy the science that reminds us. But I haven't the slightest shred of a doubt that we're all suffering from climate anxiety now, whether we know it or not, whether we like it or not, whether we admit it or not. And then there's aggression. It failing to confront the climate crisis when we know how much future generations are going to suffer does have an explanation: aggression. passive, active, conscious, unconscious, boil out the qualifiers, it's still there. How do you explain it? Revenge? Is it the ultimate narcissistic blow to be dead when they are alive? My colleagues and I would have no trouble calling this out in patients who, for example, would leave their estate in disarray, knowing their competitive children would have to pick up the pieces as a form of aggression. I hope, I believe rightly, I believe rightly, described inaction on climate as a form of child abuse, but I won't go any further with that. Then there are dependency issues. Many of us hoping that some magical parent or technology, deus ex machina, will come and rescue us at the last minute. And then there's entitlement. And this is the one that really bothers me immensely, and that is that many people who are privileged with money and power, as I said earlier, who are critical of those with their entitlements, but the entitlement that is the most unjust is living a high carbon lifestyle. So what does social psychology tell us about inaction on climate? Lots. In 1964, this is the bystander effect, 28-year-old Kitty Genovese was stabbed to death. And it was said that people didn't call the police. That was later questioned. But the overarching issue was, had the anonymity of the city become so great that people didn't really care about each other's suffering anymore? It was studied. Darley and Latane described this bystander effect. And this is what they said is the effect of the crowd. When it comes to intervening in crisis, the effect, the larger the crowd, the less likely we are to act. Think of it in terms of climate. Why? What's the effect of the crowd? Well, the diffusion of responsibility, influence of what other people are doing or not doing, dependency issues, and anonymity. No one knows me. No one can see that I'm not taking action. They can't see the my carbon footprint. And the factors influencing action, in contrast, note the important two-step process. The situation is perceived as an emergency and an identifiable action can be taken. So then there's the tragedy of the commons. Briefly, you may recall or have learned about this. It's a case where pasture for cattle was used, and everyone used it only in accordance with his or her personal interest, contrary to the common good of all, and in the end, used up all the resources and spoiled it for everyone else. Obviously, this is a climate metaphor. So why are we reluctant to discuss climate change with friends? And this comes up often. I'm not going to go into detail, but we know that we're not so popular. I can shut a dinner party down in minutes if I feel like it. And sometimes I do, even though I say I'm not going to. But it's very upsetting when we know the truth and we're struggling with it, and other people seem to be so far removed. And I'll say, if you aren't upset, you aren't listening, and it's not fair. So let's talk about messaging that works and influencing people ethically. Risk perception. If you want someone to pay attention, a message that contains threats is effective because our survival instinct kicks in. Whoa, that could really hurt me. The more likely we are to imagine a dreadful loss, the more we're paying attention. And we will take action because taking action reduces the anxiety. So how we respond to threats can define our coping styles. And there are two coping styles that I would like to bring up. One is the vigilance. On one side of the spectrum, they control danger by knowing absolutely every single detail. They can't stop thinking about it, and that's how they deal with their anxiety. On the other end of the spectrum are the cognitive avoiders, who try to control their fear by denying and downplaying the fact. We saw this with COVID. There's different messaging, as you can see. Talking about stewardship sometimes helps with the cognitive avoiders. And so I'm going to get to that in a second about special messaging. But the key issue is that it's really a two-step process in reaching people. Most people talk about the problem, describe it in no uncertain terms, and then segue immediately to here's what we can do about it. This is the sense of agency that reduces our anxiety. So I'd like also, here's a kind of a fun little thing for you to know about, and that is we don't have to choose between doom and gloom and sugarcoating the reality because of this two-step process. And I would like to point out also that humans are highly suggestible creatures, which we can use. We model our behaviors after what we see others doing. We're copycats. And the subliminal force makes social norms, that is, the behaviors we see as normal, so powerful when it comes to climate, because that herd mentality to take action is something that we see as a survival instinct, evolutionarily prescribed. So social norms are so powerful in getting people to make change. So don't look for celebrities to change us. Look for people that we can identify with and say and show what they are doing to change. And here's where it gets even more interesting. And that is that many people believe and say that what they, oops, oh gosh, I didn't want to do that. I wanted to do that. That most people will say that people self-report they take action for the planet because in this order, it benefits society, that helps save the environment, it saves money, and last, because other people are doing it. But here's what Master of Persuasion Cialdini tells us is actually happening: just the opposite. We are, and this is the herd mentality, we're doing it because we see other people doing it. I'll very quickly go to the blue brain, red brain, because we're running out of time. I do want to tell you that I thank Frank Luntz, who's come over from the dark side, and he will show you and tell you, and I will as well, that conservatives and liberals use their brains differently. Conservatives tend to prefer stability to change, which liberals like, conformity to creativity, order to complexity, familiarity to novelty. And I will send along through Leslie or from anybody else more of the material about how to use certain phrases and messaging to reach liberals versus conservatives. But I did want to bring it up. Tonight's a night where this is important. So let's go now right straight away to what we can do. And I'm going to be, this is the most important part, but I think you're already doing it. This is a group that is committed. I like this part. It's fun. And that we can start with what you can do personally. Calculate your carbon footprint. See where you're doing dumb stuff. See where you're doing smart stuff. Reduce what you can, offset what you can't reduce, and most of all, recognize that you will be the most effective activist if you know how much you're contributing, how hard it is to do certain things, and how wonderful it feels when you have. Make that accounting. Professionally, that's where one website you can go to where you can find a good calculator. Professionally, there's another one. Finally, professionally, where you work, make sure there's a sustainability group, make sure that everything that can be done to reduce your carbon footprint is being done. Politically, obviously, the political impacts are key. Supporting candidates that make climate a priority, run for office yourself. Do whatever needs to be done because those upstream policies are obviously key to making change. And make sure that everything you do is advertised. Let people know if you've got solar panels or if you're taking the train instead of a plane. This is, again, that herd mentality, the social norm that is so important. I used to call these the 3 Ps, but they've grown now to 5, 6, 7 Ps. I will say that there's one more, well, actually there are 2 more, but this is one of my favorite. Last slide. And that is, as the late, great, oh gosh, he was so wonderful, Congressman John Lewis said, when you see something that is not right, that is not fair, not just, say something, do something, get in trouble, good trouble, necessary trouble. If you go on YouTube, you can find it. It is so wonderful. And I'll just say, in the end, remember that enough solar energy reaches Earth every hour to meet all the Earth's energy needs for a year. Wind provides 40 times what we need. we can change the world, but we have to be together, we have to be smart, and we have to hurry. Thank you.
Oh, Lisa, thank you so much for your talk and your time. And I'm sorry that it's such a tough evening to cover a lot of ground on this. I so appreciate your coming, and I think we don't have time for questions because people want to. I think you even want to run to get organized. But thank you again. Thank you again. We really appreciate you enormously. And thank you for all you're doing. You're so active in so many, so many ways to be, inspiring to us.
Well, thank you for being here. Thank you for all you do. This is a potpourri of topics. I hope that there was a little something there for everybody. So I got our fingers crossed for tonight and for November. And thank you very much for your attention.
Terrific. Thank you.
Right.
Bye-bye. I'll end this.